Thanks for coming out. I really was not trying to look like a dean and wearing a bow tie. I really was trying to look like the H&R Block guy. I love those commercials. But I'm glad to be here. It is a homecoming. So much of my Christian worldview was shaped and impacted by my time here at Biola and the world-class faculty, the students that I got a chance to get engaged philosophically, intellectually with, practically with, iron sharpening iron. It was just a phenomenal time. And being in Detroit, getting a chance to come out to California wasn't too bad either. And my wife was raised in Detroit, but her mom was a school teacher, so summers were free, and her family lived out here. Some of her family, her aunt, her favorite aunt and uncle lived out here. So summers for her were in Huntington Beach, California. So when we were looking at schools, kind of narrowing it down, Biola was just like the only option that she would allow me to pick. So so she got a chance to come out with me, and but I'm blessed to have a phenomenal wife, and I just want to say thanks to my wife for being with me today. We come from a beautiful city, and I just want to give greetings because I consider myself an unofficial PR rep for the city of Detroit. Now, I know you've all heard news reports, and we'll get into the challenges and the problems, but let me just say there is a tremendous amount of positive, not only energy, news, and optimism, but gospel work going on, Christ-centered gospel work going on in the city of Detroit. And I come today not down about Detroit, but I come very optimistic, not only about Detroit, but about the urban centers in our country, because I do believe that there is some tremendous movement that is happening for the kingdom in these cities. And I'll share a little bit about Detroit, almost like a case study, if you will. But I think there are some universal principles that are applicable beyond just this city that I live in and the city that I represent. But one of the things that is true about Detroit is that we're a city that's an international city that once moved the world. Anybody in here that drives a car needs to say thank you. Right? We move the world. And when that is wired into your DNA, you don't forget that. You don't forget what it's like to move the world. And I do believe, and this has been my prayer, and I see it every day unfolding right before me, is that Detroit once again will move the world. But I don't think it's going to be just through the production of automobiles, though that's been phenomenal for us by way of industry. But I do believe it's going to be because of churches that are committed to producing men and women, Christians who are very strong and thoroughly trained in the Word of God, empowered by the Spirit of God to take the gospel to the nations. And that's what I pray about, and that's what I'm most excited about. Let me tell you why I'm here representing not only the city that I love, but this Oikonomia network, which is Greek, as you know, for economics. And it's because I think there's an intersection in my life of three major things. Number one, this business background that I have. Number two, this pastoral ministry that God has given me. And now adding to that, this role that I play as campus dean for Moody Theological Seminary in Michigan. And what that does is give me a front row seat of seeing how economics, theology, mission work, evangelism, all of that city contextualization, all of that is integrated and comes to play in this wonderful lab of a city that has tremendous challenges but great opportunity to really apply what we're talking about. The sad reality is that the Christian church, the testimony for the evangelical Christian church in a contemporary sense has changed from the historical reputation we had where we ran into hurting cities, where we ran into Rome as it was falling, where we ran into places that were marked by plague and war and devastation. Now the story of the evangelical church in America, unfortunately, is we're running from broken cities. And I really do believe that one of the ways we can garner and gain back some of that influential capital that Christianity has had for so long in this country that we all must agree is slipping through our hands is to go back into these hurting cities. And what I love about Biola is that while I was here, and I believe this is true for my brothers and sisters who graduated with me and that I stay in contact with, there was this strong encouragement, not just to pray to the Lord about the what of our calling, but the where of our calling. And I think that's part of the message we need to send to students who are in institutions like this or other Christian institutions around the country, is to pray deeply about what cities need to hear what we're talking about, what cities need to experience what it is that we're learning here, and not just populating cities that have already proven to be success stories, but to go into places where the gospel really needs to be communicated because of the brokenness and the hurt that exists within these cities. My confidence, and I'm going to sound a lot like Tim Keller saying what I'm about to say, and that is that God places his people in the heart of cities, and he places cities in the hearts of his people. And I think that that's true. Adam had Eden, David had Bethlehem, Jesus had Jerusalem. Paul said, I must get to Rome. Chris Brooks is saying, I love Detroit. You got to know your city. And we got to find our cities. And when we find our cities, we need to learn those cities and find out what is the need there. Now, for me, being in an inner city, urban a community that has been marked by multi-generational poverty, this whole sense of how do we break that effectively begin to emerge. And what happened in my heart, which I'm praying will happen in urban centers across the country, is that God began to challenge me concerning this kind of blind sentimentality concerning poverty. And really begin to challenge me, are we just focused on poverty management, or are we focused in on wealth creation? Because those are two different approaches to the problem. And I think that the predominant approach that has been used concerning addressing the economic woes of our urban centers has been poverty management, this blind sentimentality concerning justice that says that the only way you can spell compassion is F-R-E-E. And if you ask the typical inner city church, how did you love on your community today? You're going to hear something like this. Or this year, we gave away 500 free backpacks. We gave away free food. We gave away meals and clothing. We paid rent. We helped people with utilities. And that sounds a lot like compassion to most inner city pastors and ministers. But God has been teaching me over the past 6 or 7 years or so that compassion does not have to always be spelled F-R-E-E. I think there's a better way to spell it, F-R-E-E-D-O-M. And I think that freedom is what we should look for. How do we move people from dependency, which is a form of bondage, to a place of empowerment and self-reliance and economic freedom and dignity, and to get them to a place where government does not have to be your God, but the Lord Jesus Christ can be. And I think this is essential to a Christian worldview, because for many of us, our Christian worldview it extends to the point of our economic philosophy. That our Christian worldview, and I can include politics in that as well, that most of us, when it comes to politics and economics, we inherit that from the community and culture and family that we were immersed in, and we don't really allow the gospel to kind of saturate that aspect of it. And we let our Christian worldview dictate our morality in different areas, or our view maybe for marriage, maybe our view concerning certain ethical aspects of character. We let the Christian worldview impact how we should love our neighbor, but what we don't do is allow that to extend to how does the gospel then impact the type of worker I should be? How does the gospel then impact the way that I should view public policy concerning economics? And so I want to talk for just a moment, with my time left, about a real Christian view, I believe, of economic renewal, urban economic renewal, but in particular, how the gospel breaks multi-generational poverty. Now, Scott kindly mentioned the book, and it's not in stores yet. It will be June 1st, so you get an advance copy. But chapter 8 of the book, I deal with this whole issue of justice in two areas: economic justice, what does that look like from a gospel-centered, Christ-centered perspective, and then I also deal with educational justice. So for those of you who do have the book, you can reference that. And one of the things that I acknowledge in the book, and I think it's important for me to acknowledge, is that we're on this journey together. And it's great to be here at Biola and the support that they've received from the Kern Foundation. We at Moody have received this. Probably about 22, 24 other Christian seminaries and colleges have received this. And so now what you're seeing happen is these types of talks about how does Christianity impact vocational stewardship? How does it impact economic philosophy? How does it impact our view of financial ordering of our lives? How does all of this bear under the weight of the gospel? What passages apply? You're seeing this conversation happen on a national scale, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. But I got to admit that for me and for our church back in Detroit, we made a lot of mistakes. Our history is that we made a lot of mistakes. And by that, what I mean is that our compassion, how many have read the book When Helping Hurts? Or some have read the book Toxic Charity, right? Or Marvin Olasky's book, The Tragedy of American Compassion. How many have read those books, right? I would encourage you, add those books to your library, because what we didn't realize is that a lot of what we were doing were actually perpetuating the problem. I'll give you one example. We have a food program at our church, like many churches, where we partner with a local food bank. We feed probably about 40 or 50 families a month. And we've been running this thing now, maybe about 13, 14 years we've been running this. Well, about 5 or 6 years ago, I asked the team who oversees that for us, of the list of families that we're feeding on a monthly basis, how many have been in that program since we started? And you can guess the percentages. It was close to about 95% of the people who had started with the program 7, 8 years into the program were still getting fed by this food bank program that we were running. Well, the goal was never that. The goal was never to have people have a life of dependency upon a free food distribution program. The goal, sincerely, was how do we help people who maybe are in a tough patch, in a tough season of life. You know, my family background, my mother was on government assistance, food stamps for a season, but she always had the goal of letting that only be a season. And when my father unfortunately divorced my mother, she had to go through that for a season, but she didn't live there. She went on, worked hard, put her boys in school, gave us a passion for education, a strong work ethic. And so the goal is to move people off of that. And what we realized is we weren't doing that. And we realized something had to change about the way we approach poverty. We had to move from just, again, I'm going to say sentimentality or alleviating our own emotional guilt. We had to move to a different justice model, and I do call economic renewal justice because I think it is a form of how we bring the justice of God to poor communities, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But we had to go to what we would call an outcome-based, measurable, results-oriented mercy ministry approach. We had to ask ourselves, before we started any mercy ministry, what are the intended outcomes? And are we achieving those outcomes? And if we're not achieving those outcomes, then are we helping the community or are we causing greater problems? And I don't want to communicate, as I go through this talk, I don't want to communicate the misguided assumption that community transformation, especially economic renewal, is just a matter of the work of the church. The reality is that in order for us to be effective in getting the outcomes that we needed from our mercy ministry programs, it was going to require collaboration. It was going to require kind of a new mindset with all of our partners. We had to challenge our partners and say, hey, we got a problem. 95% of the people who are coming into this program are staying on this program. How do we change that? What do we do? How do we measure that? And that's not been easy. It's a difficult task. We're still doing that work. But community transformation, I think this is critical, community transformation is a multi-sector collaborative endeavor. If we're going to see communities transformed, it's going to be the church, hopefully being a catalyst. but it's also going to be a church being a cooperative partner with civic leaders, with the corporate sector of the city, challenging everyone to think about effectiveness and outcomes and the goal of moving people, again, to self-reliance and financial stability. Let me just talk for a moment about this whole thought of what the gospel should do when we go into communities. I love this quote by Chuck Colson. As Christ ministers through us, we will begin to see healing in our land, not through government programs or distant relief funds, but by rolling up our shirt sleeves, taking on the concerns of the needy, and sharing in their suffering. This is the model Christ gives us. I want you to notice two things about that quote. First thing that you should notice is the sense of solidarity that Chuck Colson spurs us to concerning those who are in poor communities or experiencing poverty. As long as we kind of have an us-them mindset where we become the rescuers of those who are ensnared by the ills of poverty, and assuming that also means that they're not Christian, sub-Christian, if you will, then we will never experience the outcomes that God wants us to experience. It's only in solidarity that we experience the mutual benefit of being able to say, I can learn from those who I'm also trying to minister to and to help. And that's something that has to do more with our approach to evangelization. And if you notice what Chuck Colson challenges is this kind of waiting on Superman mentality. This government dependency, this sense that somebody's going to rescue me. And as much as I love my city, let me just tell you that this type of multi-generational waiting on Superman mentality produces not just dependency, but it also produces a deep sense of entitlement. And this is what I love about the book, When Helping Hurts. And some of you have heard this kind of, this motto of if you give someone something, kind of this one-way charity, if you give it to them one time, you produce appreciation. You do it twice, you produce anticipation. By the time you do it 6 times, you produce entitlement and dependency. Where they're no longer just anticipating it, it's my right for you to have to pay. It's funny because for some of our programs now, we're changing to this sense of expectation and requirement that if you're going to go through this program, you're going to have to either attend a class or go through some type of discipleship ministry or bring your budget, your expenses and bills so that a budget counselor can meet with you. And you'd be amazed at how many people will say, well, you don't have the right to do that. Right? Because their thought is, you're a government program, you can't require anything of me. And what a joy it is to be able to say, well, we're not a government program. And we do have the right to do it. You know, and if you're going to be in this process, not only do we have a right to do it, but we feel like it's the right way for us to do it. Let me talk a little bit about what happens when a church does not fulfill its calling of rolling up our sleeves and getting involved in an effective way of addressing poverty. And I want to use Detroit as a case study, and I kind of call this section of my talk Detroit Dependency and Dads. Let's talk about those 3 things. Let me give you just kind of an overview of the city that I'm in so that you can get a sense of what Detroit looks like. Now, I talked about some of the positive things, and I'm going to get back to why I'm optimistic as well in a moment. But some of you know that Detroit was the largest city to file public bankruptcy. We were appointed an emergency financial manager, Kevin Orr, last year, who hopefully will only have an 18-month stint, whose job it is to kind of put us back on a balanced budget and a pathway to financial health, kind of a way forward. But let me just tell you the obstacle that he has to overcome. Number one, Detroit is a local government, has a local government like many other cities that is heavily dependent upon federal government. So whenever your local government is very dependent upon the federal government for subsidies for just about everything, the fear of breaking away from that is so daunting that it really produces stagnation. And it forces you to buy into this whole sense that the best way to alleviate poverty is through massive government programs. This kind of war on poverty that's been happening since FDR. Now, let me tell you why that doesn't work. It's because massive government programs, unlike, for example, microfinancing, some of you have heard about microfinancing, massive government programs by necessity have to be generic. They have to be cookie cutter. They can't be customized to the person, the unique dynamics and variables that exist within given communities. They have to be generic enough to be mass produced and rolled out across the country. Whereas, as we know, solutions that work really factor in the uniqueness of the person, the community, the family that I'm really trying to liberate from this cycle of poverty. One great example of this is the urban housing programs that we saw mark the last 50 years that produce these massive urban housing project plans. And we see these projects that popped up in major cities, urban cities around the country that now are being torn down en masse because it was a failed project. Places like Cabrini Green, places like the Pruitt projects in St. Louis or in Detroit, the Jeffries projects, which all it did is consolidate poverty and poor people into one tight place where you're unemployed, no jobs, crime begins to populate. And so now you have violence, crime, poverty all together in one place. And if you've ever seen the movie New Jack City, you know what I'm talking about, right? And those of you who've seen that was the outcome of this project housing deal, instead of, which I think is a better approach, of being able to say to local governments, here's how we are going to approach this. We're going to allow there to be allotment of grants and housing credits that are able to incentivize home buyers, and working with those communities, giving them the autonomy to be able to implement programs and plans that are unique and contextualized to their own backyard. Well, Detroit was a product of that. In many ways, I think Detroit becomes the case study for what happens when big government economic programs try to solve a particular community's economic crises. Detroit has a population now of 700,000 people, 705,000 people, down from our height of 1.8 million people. Now, still a lot of people in the region, but a lot of people also moved out and bailed ship. Now, the real statistic of unemployment in the city of Detroit is 54.5%. 54.5% of the residents of the city are currently unemployed. Now, of that 46% that is working, I want you to think about this. 15% of that 46%, they're working in the public sector. So if you combine the 54% with the 15%, so 54% are unemployed, which means that by necessity, if they're going to survive, they're going to have to receive some sense of government subsidization, right? Got tongue-tied. 15% working in the public sector. That's 70% rather. 70% that their living and existence is dependent upon the government. I'm going to make a political tie into this in just a moment. So you have about 30% that works in the private sector, right? 30% that works in the private sector, which is ultimately what we want to do. We want to move people into the private sector as much as possible, because it's within the private sector that thriving nations produce the most wealth. If you study the most prosperous nations in the country, about 60% of their population of thriving countries economically will work in the private sector, all right? 37% of the families in the city that I live in receive food stamps. And it totals about $500 million a year. About $500 million a year in food assistance flows into Detroit, and it's been at that level for multiple generations. So I want to tie this into politics just a little bit. Imagine what government looks like for a young person who's growing up in a family, right, where the government is paying for your food, the government is paying for your rent or mortgage, right? Everything's being subsidized by the government, and it's been so for multiple generations. The government no longer is an entity that we evaluate objectively and make decisions based off a policy approach, But the government now becomes a quasi-parent. It becomes almost like a father. And I think that this is a part of the psychology that you find in urban communities, urban ethnic communities. The relationship is far more than just your typical approach to politics. It is deeper, and it is far more family oriented than what I think we realize. In Detroit in 2012, 12,000 babies were born. And that's the approximate number that you see over 2013 as well. Of those, 9,124 of those babies were born into single-parent homes. That's 75.4%. 75.4%. And again, the numbers, I keep saying Detroit, but how many know that this isn't just Detroit? And I also want to say something else that I think is critical. Especially being in a predominantly white evangelical school, I want to make sure that I'm clear in saying that poverty is not just a black or minority issue. And I think that's important as well, right? Numerically, the vast majority of poverty is a white issue, and I think we need to take that just as seriously as we do black, Hispanic, or Latino poverty. So I'm not trying to paint a picture that only this is just a black issue. Okay, but I do want to make sure that people understand that the numbers that I'm saying for Detroit are true for most urban cities. And so if we are Christians who are trying to advance the gospel and we're asking ourselves, how can we have the greatest impact on these cities? It seems to me that one of the things we would do is to say, Lord, let me zero down on what the gospel, what scriptures have to say about economic renewal, about Christ-centered financial management, how you order our vocational lives. Let me have a rich sense of what your scriptures have to say about that. And the wonderful thing is that Biola's doing that work, and I thank God for it. Now, let me give you some reasons for optimism. The thing that I love about being in Detroit, the massive amount of human capital and the energy that's there, the entrepreneurial spirit that's there, even though I acknowledge the dependency that has been there and how that undermines aspirations, there is still a strong desire and passion for freedom, financially, and entrepreneurship, and the ability. Everybody you meet in Detroit just about wants to start something, wants to own their own thing. And I think that's tremendously exciting, and we need to tap into that type of creativity. And I think that's true if you go into most urban neighborhoods in this country. You'll find a whole lot of entrepreneurs that if they had the right support and the right investment, the right mentorship, they would take those skills and do some phenomenal things. And so I'm excited about it. According to careerbuilders.com, Detroit is the fourth leading city in private sector job growth. In 2007, we had 7% private sector job growth, just behind San Jose, Houston, and Austin. Our auto industry is making a comeback. In spite of the stuff that's going on currently with GM, we're excited about that. Business startups are huge. Some of you may be familiar with Dan Gilbert. Quicken Loans, the owner of Cleveland Cavaliers, the guy who burned LeBron's big poster when he left Cleveland. Some of you may remember that if you don't remember anything else. But he's helping along with a vibrant business community to really spur on the private sector entrepreneurship. The philanthropic community has been great. Skillman Foundation, DeVos Foundation, Kresge Foundation, they've contributed over $300 million to our community in what's known as a Good Neighborhoods Project. It's really focusing in on neighborhoods with a high population and concentration of youth and how we make sure they have every opportunity to succeed. I'm also excited about our city because of this unprecedented sense of unity that we're seeing within the churches. There is a movement in the city of Detroit called Each, Everyone a Chance to Hear, where 500 churches have come together to collaborate and say, how do we do good works that produce goodwill, that opens the door for good news? Now, this is important because what it's done is it's positioned the church to not operate independently, but to operate as a catalyst, as a leader. And I think that's what we have to do, and no church can do it by itself. So how do we break, though, the cycle? I've talked a little bit about looking at Scripture, and we need to do that. How do we break the cycle of dependency? Well, I think the answer lies in Scripture, and I want to look at one text of Scripture, and that's Ephesians 4:28. Here's what Paul writes: "Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need." Now, I don't have time to get into the deep exegesis of this text, but let me just say three things that Paul brings out here. Number one, he says that the purpose of toiling is not just so we can have resources, but he has a view towards the distribution of those resources. And I think this is where the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement has really lost focus, and the church has an ability to step into that vacuum, because what you have right now is this kind of polarizing effect of wealth creation being protected, this fierce passion to protect wealth creation from those who want to infringe upon wealth creation. So there's a group of people who have worked hard and been able to produce enough money to not only provide for themselves, but do maybe some extra work on top of that. And their great fear is, here comes a socialist government trying to infringe upon that, right? And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, kind of this Occupy Wall Street movement that is very much centered upon fair wages, trying to make a living, saying that, man, my pay is so much different than the CEO's pay. And you have these two forces at tension with one another. And what Paul says is, here's the way we solve this problem, is we encourage wealth creation. That's not a bad thing. How many know that? Wealth creation is not a bad thing in Scripture. But he says it has to have a purpose. And wealth creation, the purpose of it, if we get it as evangelicals, is ultimately through our own volition of the will, not imposed by any external force, but the love of God should compel us to say, how do we use our wealth as an instrument for justice? How do we use our wealth as an instrument for liberation? How do we use our wealth as a tool for the advancement of the kingdom? This is the reason why God gives money in the first place. So there's kind of this three-legged stool that I believe that Scripture presents to us about God's economic plan. Biblical economics summed up in these three things. Number one, God-honoring wealth creation. Number two, wealth management, because you have to protect what you created. And then number three, wealth distribution, God-honoring wealth distribution. And what you see primarily in the Old Testament narrative is God blessing Israel in the area of wealth creation. The Old Testament, the major economic emphasis of that has to do with wealth creation in a God-honoring way, as we see this small nation prospering. When you get to the New Testament, the commandments of Christ center primarily on this sense of generosity. Is far better to give than to receive. Acts 20:35. Wealth distribution seems to be the emphasis. But these things are not at odds or at war with one another, but they're the continuation of the same story. They come up under the umbrella of the same narrative, and sandwiched in between this wealth creation and this wealth distribution is wealth management. Did I lose anybody there? And so what we have to communicate in our cities and communities is we have to challenge this kind of zero-sum game, or this zero-sum philosophy that most people have and has been really reinforced over the past decade or so in America concerning wealth. And the zero-sum philosophy says that every time someone in America reaches the point of financial strength and stability, that necessarily means that somebody else has descended into poverty, as if wealth is this fixed pie and we all have to fight over slices of it. When the reality is that the resources that God has placed within this earth are more than enough for everyone who populates this planet, and we don't have to fight over the resources. We have to celebrate it, and when we learn how to collaborate with one another, everyone wins. And I think the zero-sum mentality is so ingrained in our urban centers, and that's what we have to come against. We shouldn't get mad when people prosper. We should celebrate that, and we should work to make sure we produce free societies where that can happen over and over again. But we don't just embrace capitalism without morality. See, Christians are very important to the experiment of capitalism because we bring the ethical backbone to it that says making money must have an end goal, and that end goal in in light of Christ and the cross is justice, compassion, and mercy, and that's the way that we keep it healthy. Now, every church has the responsibility in our urban centers of increasing its financial IQ. Now, how do we do that? And I want to talk about wealth creation. Then I want to spend a minute talking about wealth distribution. And then I'm going to end with, I'm going to talk about wealth creation, wealth management, then end with wealth distribution. Then I'll do an altar call and we'll be able to go home. All right, so increasing our financial IQ. There's only two ways you can increase the financial IQ of the church. And I'm going to use baseball as an analogy, either through free agency or the farm system. And what I mean by that is either you're going to take the individuals within your church and you're going to send them to places like the Acton Institute. You're going to resource them with writings from Abraham Kuyper and Father Robert Sirico and people like Anthony Bradley and Wayne Grudem and Wayne Gordon and all these individuals who are writing on the topics that I'm elucidating today. You're going to take that seriously, and you're going to begin to have discussions within your team. And I pray that that's a big part of it, because I think what sports have shown us is that teams that build through the draft or through the farm system in baseball, they have greater probability for longer term success than free agency. And you see it like, and many may even remember the Marlins, the Florida Marlins from the 90s. They're great for buying championships, and then the next year the team just blows up. And all the players just kind of go their own way, and they, a couple years later, buy another championship. But the kingdom is about sustainability. Paul describes the Christian life almost like a relay race. You run your leg of the race, you pass the baton on to the next generation. So we want to build sustainability. So I'm a big advocate of training who you have. Work with those that God has given you. But there are times when a church does not have individuals with strong financial backgrounds in their community of faith. And so it's important then to reach beyond your walls. And you can do that. I mean, reaching beyond our walls and saying to other Christian financial professionals, can you come in? Can you do workshops? Can you do education? Because if we don't know better, we can't do better. So financial literacy and education is huge. And this then helps us to move people to not only understanding how money works, but hopefully developing a plan on how they, on an individual level, can begin to create wealth within their own lives. And there's three ways where this is done. And I'm juxtaposing this against a fourth way that we normally take. And I'm using all E's for this. The three ways where wealth is created, three ways to create wealth, is through education, employment, and entrepreneurship. Those are the three items that produces wealth and moves people to financial sustainability. And that's what we need to focus in on. How can we get as many people to experience greater access to the best education possible, greater access to employment, great jobs, greater access to entrepreneurship? And just as an aside, as a parenthetical thought, this is where the bulk of our justice work has to be done, and it has been in minority communities by and large. But the greatest work of our justice has to be removing the barriers that limit people from these three E's. But there's another E that we rely on that never will produce wealth, and that's emergency assistance. Emergency assistance does not produce wealth. There's no government on this planet whose story is international aid brought them to a place of prosperity, right? What emergency assistance does is it makes living in poverty more manageable. And I'm not anti-emergency assistance if put in its proper context. If tornadoes sweep through the heartland of our country, right, like it did with Joplin, Missouri, you need to have emergency assistance. How many know you better have fresh water? You better have clothes. You better have toiletry. You better have food. You better have some place for people to stay. You need emergency assistance. But if you ultimately want to get that city back on the road to prosperity, like in New Orleans, you better also have commerce and industry and entrepreneurship and educational opportunities. There has to be something else that comes behind the emergency assistance. So my great challenge within the urban context campus that I get a chance to minister within and lecture and teach within is to use emergency assistance as a bridge to economic stability, but not as a substitute. Does that make sense? And so part of what we've tried to do in understanding the demographics and the context in which we get a chance to minister, part of what we've tried to do in the city is to say, what are the statistics around these three things, what's being done, doing some neighborhood mapping, and I'm going to talk to the faculty about that tomorrow, neighborhood mapping, exegeting your community the same way you would exegete a passage of scripture, being able to do hermeneutics on a community, what that looks like. And one of the things we discovered in our own backyard, in our zip code, is we only had about 11% of our population, the zip code in which our church exists, that have bachelor's degrees or better. And so we said the best thing we can do is try to partner with a strong Christian college to be able to come into this zip code. And we were blessed to be able to form a partnership with Grace College out of Winona Lake, Indiana, who opened up an extension campus in our zip code so that folks didn't have to worry about transportation barriers. How can I get to that school? But they can come right around the block, go to a school, and it doesn't have to be a secular community college either. And don't get me wrong, community colleges have served the communities well, but let me just say, if I have the option of sending someone to a school that reinforces a Christian worldview, I'm going to choose that 10 times out of 10. We also need within our churches, as we talk about wealth creation, to restore a reform vision or a reform view of vocation. This reformation view, I should say, a reformation view of vocation. And when I say reformation or reform view, what I'm looking at primarily is that the reformers, unlike Catholicism during the time of the Reformation, tore down this wall between the secular and the sacred, where if you really wanted to honor God, you get a clergy collar, right? Now after the Reformation, a plowman can honor God. After the Reformation, your typical average laborer could honor God in the work that he's doing, she's doing with their own hands. And what we have to say to the business people in our churches is that you have value in honoring God in the work that you do. The work that you do is very important to the mission of the kingdom. And the sad thing, especially in the black church, if you can't preach and you can't sing, you don't have a role. Right? And that just about sums it up, right? Well, you do have a role, and your role is to bring your checkbook every week. Yeah. That's your role. So preach, sing, or write a check, right? That's typically the way that it's been. But the reality is that when we begin to empower people to say, number one, our discipleship is not just to hopefully produce men and women who are ordained to preach and teach, but hopefully we will disciple men and women who will take on leadership roles in government, in education, in business, in media. We have to treat those ordinations and callings as just as holy and sacred as the calling is to preach. And you answer me this question: which is more important to the kingdom and the local church, the pastor or a sanctified accountant? You know, you got to debate that, right? Because I don't know about you, but I love prison ministry from the outside. That's the way I prefer to do it, right? But the sense of the merchant, the worker, the business person being a part of God's plan to restore all things, his glorious plan to show his diversity, that the same God who made the heavenly bodies also made these creeping things that creep upon the planet, that God is terribly diverse in his creativity. The artist has to participate in the glory of God. The business person, the merchant participates in the glory of God. Thank God the pastors, we lowly pastors, we have a participation in that. The theologian has a participation in that. We have to become broader in this sense of who God uses and to kind of liberate the congregation to say, go forth in your own creative graces and glorify God. And I love the book that was written by Professor Robert Kennedy, The Good That Business Does, another book that you should add to your library. And here's what he says. Reformation theologians also acknowledge the legitimacy of commerce and its vital role in providing goods for the community and increasing the nation's wealth. So they saw that the merchant provided needed goods for the community. I'm telling you, my community, I thank God for the honest merchants in my community, as opposed to those who are predatory lenders, those who come in and strip the community of its assets with no concern for the people who occupy the neighborhoods that purchase at their stores. We have to challenge this, and we have to disciple business people to say, you do the community much good just by owning an ethical business that's going to price fairly. You know, when was the last time you heard a sermon about fair pricing for business owners, right? We need more sermons about that, because the goal, and let me just say, one step towards seeing vocation as important is for pastors to get an evangelistic view of the workplace. And we were talking about that before we started. And you see a lot of churches are going towards workplace Bible studies. We're even doing that, trying to see the workplace as a place to win souls. And that's great. But that's not the only message I'm communicating. So I'm not saying just go back and say, hey, start a Bible study, prayer group at your. No, what I'm saying is we need to begin to say, what does fair pricing look like? From a gospel-centered perspective, how do we price our products, right? What type of services are needed? How should we perform our services if we are Christians? I remember a few years ago, we started this initiative where we wanted to support the businesses in our church, and we started an initiative where we put out a yellow pages, all the businesses in our church. And I don't know why I was crazy enough to do that, because my phone began to ring. And as my phone rang, it was story after story of this person didn't finish the job, and this person came late, and I took my car to this mechanic, and they were in your yellow page. It went from being the church's yellow pages to my yellow pages, right? And I saw, much to my shame, that as a pastor, this was an area of discipleship that I hadn't focused in on like I should. We have to train our merchants, our business people, our professionals on how do you carry yourself like a Christian should. Do we think that the predatory lending crises that caused the housing bubble to burst in 2008 was only the product of non-Christian people in that industry? No, the reality is that in the housing sector, in the financial markets, you know, I worked at Morgan Stanley. At the beginning of my career, I worked in the financial services industry before I crossed over into full-time pastorate. I recognized that there were a lot of Christians that I worked next to that went to church on Sunday, but the gospel didn't extend to the way that we carried ourselves in the IPOs we recommended, the stocks that we recommended, the way that we approached lending. And it was all about the personal goal of commissions and salary. And this is the environment that most of our professionals are in, this pressure for the company's bottom line or their personal bottom line instead of the kingdom's bottom line. And we have to challenge that. Robert Kennedy goes on to say, the honest merchant, in their view, in the Reformation's view, carried on God's work by distributing fairly the resources that the Creator has scattered unevenly about the earth. Commerce, as a result, was an instrument of justice. Commerce was an instrument of justice and a vehicle for improving the fellowship of the human race. So let's talk about wealth management. And I'll be very brief here because the Bible doesn't really get into a lot of the whole thought of wealth management. But what it does get into is this whole sense of wealth being a multi-generational endeavor. That hopefully we know that the good man, right, has an inheritance, according to Proverbs 13:22, for not just his children, but what? His children's children. So if we're going to have wealth that is multi-generational, you have to talk about products like life insurance, trusts, estates, wills. These types of things are important, and we have to have these conversations in churches. Just about every urban church I know is at risk of having a very major portion of their budget hurt because of subsidizing funeral expenses. That's a huge urban problem. You want to put on a workshop for urban churches, put on a workshop about how to avoid your budget being busted because of subsidizing funeral expenses. But this is what happens when you don't talk about things like life insurance. Again, when was the last time you heard a Sunday sermon on life insurance or estate planning? We need to have these conversations, because if not, wealth at best will extend one generation. And then at the end, because of taxes and probation, wills and estates, right? As you go through this whole litigation process, what you find is that the bulk of the estate ends up being lost and never passed down to the next generation. When you look at the rates and the expenses associated with probate court, what you find is that most families end up, at the end of the day, if they don't do effective planning, getting about 50% of the estate that should have come down to them. And I love the government. I don't mind paying my fair share of taxes, but I want the bulk of what I've worked hard for to be extended to my wife and my children. Wealth distribution. I'll end here with wealth distribution. Seeing wealth as an instrument of justice. Wesley K. Wilmer, in his book, Revolution in Generosity, gives us 4 steps to becoming a generous steward of God's resources. The first step that he says is we have to acknowledge our self-centeredness. We have to acknowledge that for most of us, every time we get a paycheck, our natural assumption is to assume that God has given us that paycheck for it to 100% be consumed upon ourselves. Some of us extend to the point where we say, well, no, 10% goes to charitable giving to local church. But what if God had a different plan for your wealth? And what if he determined in his own sovereignty that some of the money that you received was not meant for you or self-consumption, but it was meant for doing works of generosity, compassion, mercy, and justice for others? We have to acknowledge that this is something that doesn't come natural to the human race. It's not an urban thing, it's a human thing. Second, we have to accept Christ's offer for transformation. And this is a wonderful message of the gospel, is that we can be transformed. Third, we have to choose God's eternal kingdom over this earthly kingdom. And that's a choice we have every time dollars come into our hand. Am I going to use these resources for advancing God's eternal kingdom? Or am I going to use these resources for earthly, carnal things only, without a view towards eternity? And let me just also say that part of the reason why we're losing culture wars is because of sheer economics. If you have 2 armies going up against one another, one is very well funded and one is underfunded, who's going to win? And the reality is that most of our dollars as Christians, in some way or another, is subsidizing the same sin industries that we preach against. Imagine if Christians decided that we weren't going to subsidize, right, unhealthy media. We weren't going to subsidize pornography. We weren't going to subsidize casinos and gambling and all these things. If just the Christian dollars came out of the abortion industry, imagine what would happen to it. So we're a strong economic power, and even Hollywood has taken notice of it, right? Because you put a Christian movie out, we're going to buy out theaters. We're going to at least send our youth group, right? Right? So we have to understand that economic power and say, what if we funded Christian industry or decided that we were going to have a heavy economic presence in areas that advance the cause of Christ? Let me just give you this 4th point about wealth distribution, becoming generous. His 4th point is, become conformed to Christ's image by implementing genuine generosity as generosity towards Christ. That we see our generosity, not just me giving to the person sitting next to me, but me extending this cup of water, me clothing this person who needs clothes, me helping my brother or sister, is me doing it unto him. As much as you've done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. I can go on and on about this topic, but let me just say this point, is that I approach charitable giving the same way I did as a stockbroker approached investing. You don't just give your money away just because people pull at your heartstrings. You can't be effective that way. You have to look at and ask yourself, who is having the greatest kingdom impact? So my recommendation is, when it comes to our charity, that we begin to ask what organizations are actually getting the job done. Our church took up a modest offering when last year when the hurricanes hit the Philippines. We took up a modest offering, but before we did that, we said we want to research organizations and agencies that are actually doing the work, as opposed to just rushing to just give money away because it's the right thing to do, or it makes us feel better, or relieves our guilty consciences. So my advice, my admonishment is, when it comes to wealth distribution, we have a God-given responsibility to steward that well and to invest in the best people and projects that are producing the most kingdom good. And so if we're going to liberate urban communities in particular out of multi-generational poverty, we have to focus in on this three-pronged approach of wealth creation, wealth distribution, wealth management, wealth distribution, all with a focus on honoring God through the gospel. Thank you.
You have to stay up here.
Okay, I got to stay up here.
All right, we're going to go ahead at 5:30. We're going to have dinner served, and so I promise we won't be late with dinner. And in case you're tempted to start with dessert, that was actually a fairly sizable temptation. We do want to have some time for questions and for discussion. There's a lot of grist for the mill here to think about. So I'm gonna leave Chris up here to address your questions. And they're going to go ahead and start serving. So, we're just going to do this in kind of an informal, free-flowing way. Is that okay with you?
That's good.
Okay.
As long as I get a chance to eat.
You will. And so we'll take as many questions as you have, and then you just enjoy the food as it comes around, and then we'll give Chris a chance to take a break, and we'll start his second session about an hour from now. Okay? You're on your own, right?
Well, thank you very much for the talk you gave. It's really, really encouraging. My name is Odette. I'm an entrepreneur.
Yes.
I'm a business owner. I've been a business owner for 16 years. In 2008, God called me into ministry, and He specifically asked me to take care of the orphans through my business. And it's been a long journey since 2008. I've learned tremendously throughout this journey, and now I'm partnering with Dream Center to start a business education, entrepreneurial program with Dream Center, and teach the children who are emancipating out of the foster care system to become jewelers.
Yes.
I will be teaching them how to make jewelry. The greatest challenge I've had since 2008 is when I go to events and I talk to ministry leaders, the first question they ask me, so who are you? Are you a pastor's wife? No. Yeah. Are you, do you have a position in the church? No. Are you a ministry leader? No. But who are you and why are you here? And I say, I'm an entrepreneur, and I want to help, and I want to make an impact in the lives of the younger generation and pass on the knowledge and the gifts that God has given me to the younger generation. And the greatest obstacle is the church. As an entrepreneur, I've experienced that, and it hurts. It's very, very difficult, and I'm glad you're. And I know we have so many pastors in the church, in here that are representing churches. How do you educate other pastors to not push entrepreneurs like me away and say, well, you never went to a seminary, or you don't have a degree from here and there, and therefore you're not good enough. You're not good enough. That's what I've experienced. You're not good enough. And I've constantly had to prove myself. I know so much. God has put it on my heart to do something. Allow me to do it. And finally, Dream Center has opened up their doors and said, hey, we're ready, come and teach these youth.
Yeah.
So-
Well, let me first off commend you for the work that you're doing, for keep on fighting that good fight. Let me also say, hopefully you'll get a chance to meet my wife, Yodit. She's also, we're also very passionate about the orphan. Foster and adoption ministry. My wife launched a ministry several years ago called Infinite Love that advocates for the life of the unborn and the foster child and the adoptive child. And so it'd be great for you guys to get a chance to connect. Let me just, I think, address your question from two sides. First, as a pastor, because I got to kind of defend my comrades at arms. And then along the lines of my talk that I just gave as an entrepreneur. From a pastoral perspective, one of our responsibilities, if we're doing our job right, is the protection of the gospel. It is the protection of those who will receive from your ministry, to make sure that what they're receiving is biblically faithful and consistent. So you may get pastors who say, well, have you been trained? And what type of theological background do you have? But don't see that always as them trying to rain on your parade. See part of it as them fulfilling the protective job that we're responsible for, because ultimately I'm going to have to stand before the Lord. And what I can't do as a steward of the gospel is just say to people, hey, here's a great entrepreneur, wonderful heart, knows zero about scripture, but they're a great business person, go ahead and hang out with them, right? I have to kind of play that protective role. Now, but from your side of things, I think that part of the only thing you can do, because I get the privilege of being able to challenge pastors in forums like this, so know that I'm out there fighting with you. But on your side of things, what you can do is to humbly say to the Christian community, I know I'm a business owner. I understand that there's limitations to our role, just as there's limitations to everyone's role and how we advance the kingdom. But I would love to partner with you as a pastor, as someone who has been trained in issues of theology. I'm not trying to take over the church. I just really want to help these orphans. Can we work together in partnership? Using that type of phraseology, partnership. And let me just say one more thing as a pastor. One of the challenges that we have is that, especially if you're a pastor of a church that has some level of prominence, you're always being sold something. Everybody wants you to endorse their product, endorse their program, sign up for their ministry, sign up for their initiative. And so you have to filter. And so be patient and try your best to say, how can what I'm doing fit into the vision of the church? Is there a role for what I'm doing in the vision of the local church? Because when you use the language of the vision of this local church, you really disarm pastors. And now you're saying, hey, I want to be on your side, as opposed to I'm just soliciting you for your support. So hopefully that helps. But stay encouraged. You're doing a great work.
Do you know of a program or a church or what that is effectively using the education, employment, entrepreneurship model in a first-generation Latino community, especially with a lot of undocumented immigrants?
Well, in Detroit, we have a great church, First Spanish Baptist. It's not first generation anymore. It's been around now for about 30, 35 years. They have two services, one that's in just Spanish, and then a second service is English. So I do know that, and I can give you that connection and that referral. The pastor's Eli Garza is doing a great work. I don't know if many of you know about the ethnic breakdown of Detroit, but we have a strong Latino, Hispanic population in Southwest Detroit, and so that's one referral that I can give to you. And I would say also the Hispanic Evangelical Network is a great place to look as well. There are a lot of great leaders that are there. But I do know in our own local context. So I'll be happy to make that connection with you. Okay? It's not easy. It's not easy. Let me just say it's not easy. In Detroit, one of the things that we find is that in that Hispanic community, far more than the black community, you find that the people are just far more transient, right? So you really don't have that long of a time as you would like to be able to walk someone through this long process of stability. I don't want to paint it as if you tell somebody, hey, launch a business, and tomorrow they're rich and everything's great. It takes a long time. And so part of what you have to ask yourself if you're going to be ministering to a transient community is, how do we set up a system that can produce some fruit within a 12-month period? If we only have someone for 12 months, what's the best good we can do in this particular area for them? And I think the biggest thing you could do is exposure. A lot of exposure and a lot of addressing the undercurrent issues that oftentimes keep people in not only spiritual bondage, but financial bondage as well. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to get into issues of addiction and, family breakdown. There's a lot of things that play into this also.
Yeah. I just want to really appreciate, express my appreciation for all that you've presented, and I know it's just a snapshot. And two areas I just like to hear you speak more on is, one, how it actually looks, besides preaching on life insurance, which I know you're half-heartedly saying it's true, but
yes,
I'm very interested in the workplace ministry beyond the Bible study at the work, but empowering as a school board members that I know, and many civil servants that need to be encouraged that they are called to those offices. So what does that look like from the pulpit? What does that look like in the church? That's the first area. The second is this idea of being in the world but not of the world when it comes to business. What does a Christian business really look like? What is the difference between a Christian business and a secular business, as it were, and how we communicate that? So there is a difference.
That's great.
And we don't adopt just the world's way of doing it and then lose our soul.
Yeah, so that's phenomenal. I think that to answer your first question, and that is practically, what is this whole thing of vocational stewardship look like? And I know you jokingly talked about beyond preaching about life insurance, but I will say, and I'll get beyond preaching in a moment, but I will say that preaching is very important to this whole thing, because Sundays should not be a place where we don't bring our brains. Right? We should bring our brains to church with us, and hopefully our minds should be renewed. So the basic work of a different worldview, if you will, philosophically transforming the way people approach this whole area, is done through faithful biblical preaching, almost like strokes from a painter's brush against a blank canvas. You're painting something, and you got to keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, until this beautiful image of Christ is painted in their particular area of life and work. But the practical way that it's seen, at least the way that we've tried to promote it, is this sense that every Christian should have this goal of being the best employee in their company. There should be the sense that if I don't own the company, I want to be the best employee I can be. And if we get known for that in the Christian community, which we shouldn't be the ones that are still in office supplies, right? Taking extra long lunch breaks, right? These are ethical issues, and we got to kind of call those ethical issues out. But we should be known for being such great workers that when companies want to hire, they call the local church and say, we want to put on a job fair at your campus because we want to hire the best and the brightest. So part of it is that. The other part of it is we need to celebrate what I call practical brilliance, not just theological brilliance, but when an engineer, all right, at an auto company, like what I find so often, when an engineer or auto company does something that's great, maybe gets a patent or is selected engineer of the year, there needs to be celebration of that. Just like in a lot of our churches have academic celebration. We celebrate academic success and achievement, but we need to celebrate vocational success and achievement. So if one of, we have, for example, and she's recently relocated, we have a young lady in our church who is in a management management team at Domino's Pizza, who had just been doing a great job at her company. As often as I could, I wanted to publicly recognize that type of achievement. We need to celebrate vocational achievement in a very practical way so that people in our pew say, man, I want to be a great worker as well, so that I can represent Christ that way. So I think wanting to be a phenomenal worker, and then this other thought of, and we don't want to take this too far because it can get into man-pleasing if it's not balanced, but this other call of doing your best to make your boss look as good as possible. Yeah. You know, understanding I have a responsibility to my employer, and that part of my calling, hopefully, and we see this in churches with pastors, every pastor wants a congregation or clergy that wants to make them look good. Well, the reality is that every boss, every supervisor wants to look good. And if my goal is to try my best to put my supervisor in the most positive light as possible while maintaining my ethics and my integrity, I want to try to do that. Now, I'm not advocating people pleasing, which leads to compromise, but I am saying this sense of servanthood and saying that it's good for me to work for another person's success and not just my own. That Christ did that at the cross. So, and then the second question you asked about Christian business, what makes us look different? I think, again, it's this commitment to Christian ethics, doing business. Again, that quote, I love that quote from Professor Robert Kennedy, where he talks about the good merchant, the honest merchant who distributes fairly the resources, right, that God has distributed in his world. So I think that this sense of fairness, this sense of ethics is part of it. But then the other side of it is, what do we do with resources when we get them? And hopefully we're not silent in the major justice issues of our day. Hopefully we're leveraging that, because what we're seeing now in our country is that when corporations weigh in on an issue, it really does move the issue. It really does. And if Christian business owners collaborate and say, we want to weigh in on, educational fairness, we want to weigh in on, religious liberty issues, family issues, it would move the needle. We need more Christian businesses besides just Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby, who says, hey, we're willing to put our necks on the line to fight for certain causes. We need Christian business owners to say, hey, this is a part of my calling.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.